The December wind cut through the bare fields of the Harrove plantation, biting at Silus Harrove's face and making the lantern tremble in his hand. He had told himself for years that what he was doing was necessary. Business, debts, the plantation, that was all. It was never personal. Yet as he stepped into the yard, the 12 children gathered before him. Something deeper, older than fear, coiled in his chest. They didn't speak, they didn't cry, they only stared. Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice, stood taller than the rest, his 14-year-old frame rigid, his eyes calm but sharp. There was an intelligence there that unnerved Silus more than any pleading or wailing ever could. "It's business," Silus said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. "You don't understand, I have debts." Thomas's reply was quiet, but it cut through the winter air like a knife. "We understand." And then, with a wisdom that belonged to someone older than his years, he added, "Do you?" Silus swallowed, unable to meet the boy's gaze. The fire in the yard, meant to keep the night from swallowing them whole, vanished, not flickering, not dying. It was gone, as if some invisible hand had smothered it. Darkness rushed in, thick and suffocating, pressing against his chest. His lantern cast light that barely reached a foot beyond the glass. The children were gone, and yet he knew they were there. Then the hands came. Small, cold, relentless, touching his arms, his chest, his face, not to harm, not to grab, just touch, press, memorize, and with every touch, flashes of terror, confusion, grief, rage, and despair slammed into him. Not his own, the 4-year-old girl ripped from her mother, the 6-year-old boy torn from everything he knew, parents left helpless to watch, children reduced to property, traded like livestock. He tried to pull away. Tried to escape, but they followed, pressing against him, overwhelming him. He screamed, swinging the lantern blindly. It shattered against the frozen earth. Darkness swallowed him whole. He stumbled, fell, crawled. The cold bit into his bones, but the hands, gentle, unyielding, never stopped. Every wave of feeling they pressed upon him threatened to drown what little sense of self he had left. Finally, he collapsed. Breathless, shaking, alone, the darkness receded. The first gray light of dawn stretched over the fields, and there they were. 12 children lined up as if nothing had happened, staring silently from the yard. No words, no movement, just watching, and in that moment Silus Harrove knew that they had seen him. Not the man he pretended to be, but the man he truly was. Hours later, the clatter of hooves and wheels announced Virgil Tate's arrival. Silus forced himself upright, body aching, mind reeling. Tate, tall, broad, and cold, carried a satchel heavy with gold. Behind him, 3 armed men waited silently, rifles in hand. Harrove, Tate barked. "You have them ready." Silus looked past the wagon to the children. Their faces were no longer empty, not blank, not indifferent. Humanity stared back at him, and in that moment, gold, debt, and survival meant nothing. "No," he whispered, Tate's brow furrowed. "What? The sale is off," Silus said, his voice shaking but gaining strength. "Take your gold and leave." The wagon turned, the sound of hooves fading into the dawn. Silus remained on the porch, watching the children walk back toward the quarters. Safe, untouched, unbroken. He didn't feel victory. He didn't feel relief. Only the unbearable weight of the truth he had been too blind to see. He had almost destroyed lives for money. Inside, he sat at his desk, staring at the ledger. Slowly, deliberately, he drew a line through 12 names. At the bottom of the page, he wrote 3 words: "Sale cancelled. Debt remains." Outside, the wind whispered through the bare trees, and the world began to wake. Inside Silus, something had shifted irreversibly. He was no longer the man who could look at children as property. He had seen them, felt them, understood them, and for the first time he knew the meaning of what it was to be human, and the terrible cost of failing to see it. The sun climbed slowly over the Harrove plantation, scattering the last wisps of winter fog across the frozen fields. Silus Harrove moved through the yard like a ghost, each step tentative, as if he feared the world would crumble under the weight of his choices. The children were gone from the porch now, returning to their cabins, yet their presence lingered, an invisible weight pressing on his chest. He could still feel the echoes of their hands, their emotions, the raw, unfiltered truth of what he had been willing to do. For 3 days, Silus did not leave the big house. Dutch Keller, the plantation foreman, knocked on the study door. calling for him to tend to the fields, to face creditors, to speak with neighbors. But Silus remained silent. Inside he paced, sometimes stopping to stare at the frozen horizon, eyes distant, haunted. He scribbled notes in a leather journal he had kept for years, filling page after page with the memory of that night. The fireless flames, the darkness, the hands, the emotions that had stripped him bare. By the fourth day, word had spread through the quarters. Rumors whispered that the sale had been cancelled, that the children were safe, but no one dared to ask why. Silus finally emerged. His face was gaunt, lined with fatigue and sorrow. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, now held a quiet gravity. He called the families together, standing on the same porch where he had once announced their doom. "I'm giving you a choice," he said, his voice low but steady. The words carried weight, more than they should have for a man who once wielded authority with the snap of a whip. "If you wish to leave, you may. I will provide papers saying you are free. You may go north, start over. If you wish to stay, I will pay you wages, real money, not script, and the children." He paused, swallowing. "They will be educated. You will have a teacher." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Eyes darted between neighbors, families, children, trying to discern if this was another trick, another test. Some families left immediately, gathering what little they could carry and walking into the uncertainty of a winter road that promised danger, but also freedom. 11 families departed, carrying hope in one hand and fear in the other. 12 families remained, not out of loyalty, not out of trust. They stayed because the world beyond the plantation offered no safety, no certainty. The roads were patrolled by men who would capture and re-enslave anyone without papers. Winter was harsh. Survival, not forgiveness, dictated their choice. Silus kept his word. Mrs. Calloway, a widow from Valdosta, arrived at the plantation in early January, skeptical but willing to teach. The children gathered eagerly, their faces bright with curiosity and hunger for knowledge. Letters, numbers, history, every lesson was devoured, every question asked with urgency. Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice, quickly rose beyond his peers, reading fluently within weeks. Silus observed quietly, pride and a shadow of guilt flickering across his features. He also began paying wages. Small sums in gold coins, but gold nonetheless, a currency of autonomy for people who had never truly owned anything. The fear that had once defined every corner of the plantation slowly lifted. The atmosphere shifted from oppression to purpose. Tasks were performed with diligence, but now the work carried a sense of dignity. Yet Silus himself did not find peace. He walked the fields alone at night, stopping at the edge of the cotton rows, staring into darkness as if searching for the children who had changed him forever. He attended church, silently sitting in the back pew, listening to sermons on redemption and forgiveness, letting the words seep into him like water on parched soil. Months passed. Silus wrote letters to local and state officials, advocating for the rights of formerly enslaved people. He challenged the system that had once enriched him, arguing passionately, personally, desperately. Few listened, some mocked, others threatened, but he persisted, driven by something deeper than reason, the need to honor the truth he had glimpsed that Christmas night. By the end of 1864, with Sherman's army advancing through Georgia, the world beyond the plantation was in chaos. The war ravaged towns, destroyed livelihoods, and freed countless enslaved people. Harrove Plantation, isolated and already marked by its strange events, remained largely untouched. When news of the Confederacy's collapse reached him, Silus gathered the remaining families and told them they were legally free. He offered them wages, shelter, and the choice to stay or leave. Most stayed, practical and cautious, clinging to the stability he could provide amid the turmoil. The plantation was no longer a place of ownership and oppression. It had become a community, a fragile ecosystem of labor and learning, survival and conscience, and Silus. He had become a man haunted not by ghosts, but by the reflection of what he had been and the quiet memory of what he had almost done. Years passed on the Harrove plantation, but the memory of that Christmas night never left Silus Harrove. Each winter, as frost crept across the fields and snow kissed the rooftops, he would walk to the yard at midnight, standing in the exact spot where he had seen the 12 children, their small, unyielding faces staring into him, holding him accountable. No one dared ask why, not Mrs. Calloway, not the families, not even Dutch Keller. Some whispered he was praying, others thought him mad. Silas said nothing, he only stood, letting the darkness and memory wash over him. By 1867, Silas had made a decision that shocked even the most practical men in Valdosta. He began dividing the plantation land, offering plots to the families who had stayed. He gave seed, tools, and advice, helping them establish small farms of their own. It meant sacrificing much of his wealth, but he insisted, 12 families for 12 children. Every acre he gave, every seed he sowed, was a reminder of the night that had changed him. "Why are you doing this?" the lawyer from town demanded when Silas signed over the deeds, clearly aghast. "You're giving away generations of wealth." Silas looked him in the eye, haunted and steady, because it was never mine to begin with. The big house became his only remaining property. He lived alone, rarely communicating with his own children in Savannah, who were building lives untouched by the shadow of the plantation. He spent his days reading, writing letters, and walking among the fields, paying close attention to the families who now worked as equals, not as property. Every Christmas Eve, as the plantation slept under the frozen stars, Silas walked to the yard and remembered. He remembered the fireless flames, the invisible hands, the emotions that had crushed and reshaped him. He remembered the eyes of the children, Bess, Marcus, Thomas, and the others' children who had forced him to confront himself, to feel what he had refused to see for decades. Silus Harrove fell ill in December of 1872. It began as a cough, subtle but persistent. By mid-month he was bedridden, weak and pale, yet his mind remained sharp. Mrs. Calloway visited him daily, bringing food, medicine, and her quiet presence. "Do you have regrets?" she asked one chilly afternoon, sitting beside him. Silas was silent for a long time. Finally he spoke, voice thin and trembling, but filled with the weight of years. "Only one, that it took me so long to see them as human, all of them, every single person I owned. I told myself it was business. I told myself it was the way things were, but that night, they showed me what I really was. They saved me," he added softly, "from becoming something I could never come back from." On December 23rd, Silas sealed his journals in a metal box and entrusted them to Mrs. Calloway. "Keep these safe," he said. "Someday, someone might want to know the truth of what happened, of what they did to save me." He died the next day, December 24th, just after midnight, exactly 9 years after the night that had reshaped his soul. Mrs. Calloway held his hand, feeling the life slip away quietly, his final words barely a whisper, "Forgive." The families buried him in the small cemetery on the hill, close to where Catherine had been laid to rest years before. They marked his grave simply, a stone with his name and dates, no flourish, no praise. But then they did something extraordinary. Around the grave they planted 12 small oak trees, strong, enduring, a living monument to the children who had saved a man from his own darkness. Years later, in 1891, the big house burned. It had been abandoned and decaying for decades, yet beneath the charred floorboards a metal box survived. Inside were Silas's journals, filled with accounts of his guilt, his terror, and the night that had altered the course of lives. Local historian William Brennan discovered the journals and, though disturbed, realized their importance. Accounts from the descendants of the 12 children confirmed fragments of the story. Some recalled waking Christmas morning with their children safe and no memory of the night before. Others remembered being led to the fields by Silas, where truth had been revealed without violence, without threat, only recognition and understanding. The land itself changed over decades. The plantation was subdivided, sold, and farmed by generations who had inherited freedom and opportunity. But the 12 oak trees remained, majestic, intertwined, forming a natural cathedral around Silas's grave. Visitors who came to the site felt an uncanny weight, a sense of being watched, sometimes hearing faint whispers or melodies that seemed to rise from the soil itself. Some dismissed it as imagination, the mind playing tricks. Others felt the unspoken truth of empathy and conscience, of guilt transformed into atonement. The story of Silus Harrove and the 12 children remains, a tale that refuses to fade. A story of terror transformed into redemption, of humanity glimpsed through the eyes of the innocent. It is a reminder that sometimes the most profound hauntings are not ghosts or spirits, but the reflection of ourselves, the truth of what we have done, and the chance, however slim, to change before it is too late. On Christmas night, if you walk among the 12 oaks, the wind through the branches might carry a memory, a warning, a prayer, or perhaps, just perhaps, a quiet, eternal presence reminding the living that every action, every choice carries weight, and some truths demand to be seen. Decades slipped by, and the Harrove plantation faded into memory. The big house was gone, burnt to blackened timbers, the walls reduced to ash and rubble. Nature had reclaimed the land, vines crawling over forgotten fences, wildflowers springing through the furrows where cotton had once grown. Yet the 12 oak trees remained, towering sentinels around Silus Harrove's grave, their roots intertwined like the threads of history itself. Locals called the place the Circle of 12, though few dared linger. Children whispered of shadows moving between the trunks. Adults spoke in hushed tones of the chill that rose even on warm afternoons. Travelers claimed they sometimes heard faint singing, a soft, sorrowful melody drifting with the wind. Others felt a sudden weight, a pressing awareness of wrongs long past, a call to recognize what had been hidden or ignored. Some said it was the trees themselves, holding the memory of a night that had shifted the course of lives forever. The descendants of the 12 children carried the story in their veins, though it was rarely spoken aloud. Bess, the youngest, lived to 64, always recalling her mother's trembling words from that Christmas morning. It was a miracle. God touched his heart. But Bess, with her quiet wisdom, never believed it was divine intervention. He saw us. She would say softly, really saw us, and it broke him. Others remembered small pieces. Thomas's quiet determination to teach himself, Marcus's mother clutching him, Ruth's whispered prayers that morning. Each retold memory confirmed the strange truth. Something had happened that could not be explained by ordinary reason. The children had not been harmed, they had not been punished, and yet they had changed a man. By the early 20th century, the story was a ghost, surviving only in fragmented family histories, local legends, and in rare moments in the archives of historians like Dr. Raymond Collier. Collier spent years piecing together the events from letters, journals, and testimonies. In his private notes, he wrote, "I do not know what happened on the Harrove plantation that Christmas night in 1863. I have sought rational explanations, ecological breaks, collective hallucinations, the weight of guilt manifesting in visions, yet the descendants' accounts are consistent. They describe waking to find their children safe with no memory of the night before. Something happened here, something that defies reason. Collier could not explain it, yet he could not dismiss it either. Perhaps it was empathy made tangible, a moment where 12 children forced a man to confront the full horror of his own actions. Perhaps it was divine, perhaps spectral, perhaps the unexplainable intertwining of memory, fear, and conscience. Whatever it was, its imprint endured. Even the land seemed to remember. Those who visited the 12 Oaks described the feeling of being observed, as if invisible eyes followed them between the trunks. Some spoke of sudden grief, inexplicable guilt, or a weight on the chest, fleeting but undeniable. Some claimed to hear faint whispers, the voices of children reminding the living to see, to feel, to reckon with their own choices. By the 1970s, the site had drawn historians, curious locals, and a few spiritual seekers. Archaeologists and surveyors confirmed the gravesite, the age of the trees, the placement forming a perfect circle. At the base of each tree, a small plaque now bore the name of one of the 12 children: Bess, Marcus, Lily, Samuel, Grace, Daniel, Hannah, Isaac, Abigail, Elijah, Rebecca, Thomas. Visitors often paused there, feeling the weight of history pressing through the centuries. And yet, for all its quiet majesty, the site was not a monument to Silus Harrove's sins. It was something else entirely, It was a place of reckoning, a reminder that even the darkest hearts might be capable of change, even if the cost is a lifetime of atonement. It was a testament to the power of being seen, truly seen, by those we would wrong. The story of the Harrove Plantation, the 12 children, and Silus Harrove became more than legend. It became a parable whispered across generations. Children grew up hearing fragments, understanding them only as a cautionary tale. Adults felt its weight when they walked among the oaks, compelled to reckon with the echoes of conscience. The truth remained unsettled. Some swore it was a hallucination, a collective dream born from exhaustion and fear. Others believed in the unseen power of empathy, the kind that transcends reason, demanding recognition and accountability. Whatever the case, the night of December 25, 1863, continued to haunt the land, the descendants, and those who listened closely enough to hear the whispers carried on the wind. And somewhere, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, the 12 oak trees stood as living witnesses. Silent, patient, unyielding, a reminder that some truths cannot be ignored, that sometimes the most profound hauntings are not the supernatural, but the moments when we are forced to see ourselves and the lives we touch with unflinching clarity. The legacy of Silus Harrove, of the children, and that singular Christmas night remained, etched in the land, carried in memory, and whispered in the shadows, a story of terror, guilt, empathy, and the possibility of redemption, even in the most unlikely hearts. Time stretched forward, years folding over years, and the Harrove plantation slowly faded into the whispers of memory. The cotton fields lay fallow, the fences splintered and bent with age, and the big house, once a symbol of wealth and cruelty, was reduced to blackened timbers after the fire of 1891. Yet the 12 oak trees remained, towering sentinels circling Silus Harrove's grave, their thick branches knotted together like the intertwined threads of history and conscience. People came and went, drawn to the place by curiosity, genealogy, or simply the weight of legend. Visitors often spoke of feeling eyes upon them, though none could be seen. Some heard the soft hum of children's laughter, fleeting and faint, as if carried on the wind. Others described a sudden tightness in their chest, a quiet, pressing awareness of responsibility, of past wrongs unacknowledged. They called it eerie. Some said it was haunted, but perhaps it was neither ghost nor spirit. It was memory itself, alive, demanding recognition. The descendants of the 12 children carried that night in their blood, though most spoke of it in fragments. Bess, the youngest of the 12, lived until 64, her memories of that Christmas morning fleeting but profound. She remembered her mother's trembling voice. It was a miracle. God touched his heart. But Bess never claimed it was divine. She knew it was something else, something human and terrible, a man finally seeing the truth of his own actions. Thomas, Marcus, and the others lived full lives shaped quietly by the memory of that night. Some had children of their own, instilling lessons of vigilance, empathy, and awareness. They spoke little of Silus Harrove, yet the story remained a moral compass, a reminder that even those capable of immense cruelty could be reached by the weight of conscience, if only for a moment. By the 20th century, the story was part history, part legend, passed through whispered stories and family anecdotes. Historians like Dr. Raymond Collier labored to uncover the truth. He pored over letters, journals, and testimonies, compiling accounts that made the events nearly impossible to rationalize. Some claimed Silus had suffered a psychological break, a hallucination triggered by guilt and sleep deprivation. Others swore that the children themselves, through some ineffable understanding, had forced him to see them as fully human. Collier's private notes revealed his doubt. "I cannot explain the consistency of the descendants' stories. I do not know whether to call it a miracle, a shared hallucination, or something else entirely, but it happened, that much is clear." He left the question unresolved, allowing the story to linger in the spaces between reason and wonder. The land itself seemed to remember. Walkers reported shadows between the oaks, sudden chills, faint voices that vanished when approached. Some visitors felt a weight of remorse or grief that they could not explain. Perhaps the earth had absorbed the memory, imprinting it for anyone willing to notice. Perhaps it was the echo of conscience, a reminder that justice sometimes demands only recognition, that acknowledgement can transform hearts more than punishment ever could. The Harrove plantation no longer existed as it had, yet its legacy endured. The land was subdivided, sold, farmed, and lived upon by generations who had no memory of the dark days of slavery. The big house was gone, but the 12 oak trees remained, guardians of a story that refused to be forgotten. Plaques bearing the names of the 12 children, Bess, Marcus, Lily, Samuel, Grace, Daniel, Hannah, Isaac, Abigail, Elijah, Rebecca, Thomas, marked the circle, honoring lives that had survived and grown, and a man who had finally understood the horror of what he had once sought to do. Yet the tale was not just one of history, it was a warning. The most haunting moments are rarely supernatural. They are those moments when we are forced to confront the truth of our own actions. Silus Harrove's terror was not in some ghostly curse, but in the unbearable knowledge of his own cruelty, and the children, through courage, empathy, or some inexplicable means, made him see it. Through the years, the oak trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead, forming a natural cathedral of memory. Visitors often paused in silence beneath them, feeling the weight of the past pressing gently, insistently. Some whispered prayers, others simply stood awed, and perhaps on certain nights, if the wind moved just right, one might hear faint singing, soft and sorrowful, carried through the branches. The 12 children lived, their descendants lived, and a man who had been a monster found redemption. Fragile, incomplete, but real, and still the land remembers. Because the most powerful hauntings are not those that terrify, but those that demand we witness ourselves, our actions, and the lives of others with unflinching clarity. And so, the story of Silus Harrove and the 12 children endures, not as a tale of ghosts, nor magic, nor divine wrath, but as a story of empathy, conscience, and the possibility of change, even in hearts that have known darkness. The years rolled on, and the world moved forward, oblivious to the quiet miracle of the Harrove plantation. Cotton fields turned to pastures, pastures to forests, and the roads grew long and winding, carrying travelers who would never know the history beneath their feet. But the 12 oaks endured, towering over the hill like silent sentinels, their roots tangled deep in the soil where history itself seemed to pulse. Generations of families grew and scattered, carrying with them fragments of memory, whispers of a night when a man who could have destroyed lives, instead found his conscience awakened. Descendants of Bess, Marcus, Thomas, and the others told children, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with reverent awe of a time when innocence stood unwavering against cruelty. They described the fear, the darkness, and the impossible courage it took to show a man the truth of what he was doing. By the mid-20th century, historians pieced together the fragments. Dr. Raymond Collier published The Christmas Reckoning, weaving together letters, testimonies, and journals. Scholars debated feverishly, was it a shared hallucination, divine intervention, or the sheer force of human empathy made manifest? Collier could not answer, and perhaps the mystery was meant to remain unresolved. The story's power lay not in explanation, but in its reminder that conscience, once awakened, could not easily be silenced. Visitors to the plantation cemetery felt it too. Beneath the oak canopy, time seemed to bend. Some claimed they heard the faintest echoes of children's laughter or the rustle of tiny feet brushing across frost-laden ground. Others felt pangs of guilt or sorrow, inexplicably their own yet tied to centuries-old events. And sometimes, if one closed their eyes beneath the branches, the air seemed to hum with the weight of memory, a quiet insistence that certain truths could never be buried. Silus Harrove's name was etched into a simple gravestone at the center of the 12 oaks. No grand epitaph, no flourish of praise, only dates, a marker of a life spent oscillating between darkness and the fragile light of redemption. Those who walked among the trees felt a strange reverence, an understanding that history was not merely a record of facts, but a living thing. And they left changed, carrying with them a reminder that empathy and recognition could alter hearts, even centuries later. And so the Harrove Plantation, though vanished in structure, survived in spirit. The story of a man who had almost committed an unspeakable act, and the 12 children who, in ways beyond understanding, stopped him, endured. It became a quiet legend, one passed in whispers and told with care, a narrative not of revenge or punishment, but of the transformative power of being truly seen, because some hauntings are not born of ghosts or curses. They are born of conscience, of choices nearly made and the unbearable weight of realizing the truth. And for those who walk beneath the 12 oaks, the story lingers still, a reminder of what darkness can be overcome and what humanity, when recognized, can achieve. Even decades later, on cold winter nights, some claimed they could feel it, the echo of 12 small, determined souls watching. Farmers passing through the old Harrove lands spoke of a chill that wasn't entirely from the wind, a presence that pressed on the chest and made the hair on the back of the neck rise. Children who wandered too close to the hill where the 12 oaks stood sometimes swore they saw shadows moving between the trunks, glimpses of figures that disappeared when approached. The descendants of the 12 children carried the memory quietly. Some could not speak of it, not because they didn't want to, but because it felt too immense for words. A grandmother would brush her fingers over the small, weathered oak plaques on Christmas mornings and whisper the names: Bess, Marcus, Thomas. Each syllable a vow to remember. She told her grandchildren not of magic or ghosts, but of seeing, of empathy, of the weight of being truly acknowledged. Historians and curious travelers came, drawn by the strange cluster of oak trees and the faint, persistent stories. They would tread carefully, speaking in hushed tones, and sometimes they felt it, the subtle insistence of the past that refuses to be ignored. Some wept without understanding why. Others felt the haunting grief of choices made and unmade, of horrors averted but almost realized. And above it all, the 12 oaks stood firm, unyielding, a natural cathedral where history itself seemed to breathe. The Harrove Plantation had long vanished as a place of labor and fear. The big house burned to ashes, the fields plowed anew, the cabins replaced or reclaimed by the wild. Yet the legacy endured, not just in the descendants, not just in the stories, but in the lessons etched into the land itself. The 12 children had once been powerless, but their courage changed the course of lives. Silus Harrove, haunted and broken, had spent his remaining years trying to honor that truth, and in that effort, he had left a mark that could not be erased. Visitors today may never see the children. They may never hear their voices or feel their presence. Yet, when one pauses beneath the oaks, closes their eyes, and listens to the wind through the branches, there is a sense that something extraordinary happened here. That one night in 1863, empathy and conscience collided with darkness and greed, leaving a scar on time itself, one that reminds all who come after that the weight of seeing, really seeing, can change a man, a community, a history. Because some stories are not about endings, they are about witnesses, about the invisible threads connecting lives across generations. And in the silence beneath the 12 oaks, in the cold December air, the story waits, waiting for someone to feel it, to understand it, and perhaps to carry it forward. Even after the plantation ceased to function as a place of labor, the air seemed heavy with memory. Travelers passing through the remnants of the old lands spoke of an uncanny quiet, a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the earth itself remembered the events of that Christmas night. The 12 oaks, now towering and intertwined, created a shadowed cathedral of branches overhead. Beneath them, the ground was soft with years of fallen leaves, yet some visitors claimed to hear the faintest shuffle of feet, a child's laughter caught in the wind, or whispers that vanished when addressed. The descendants of the 12 children treated the place with reverence, visiting it at significant moments, birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings. They never spoke of supernatural phenomena, only of gratitude. Their stories were careful, measured, imbued with the weight of survival and memory. A great-grandson of Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice, recounted to his children how the night his grandfather had described was not one of punishment or fear alone, but of clarity, a piercing truth that had altered the trajectory of a man's life. Historians who stumbled upon the site were captivated. They studied the gravestone, the ring of oak trees, and the weathered plaques bearing the children's names, most left with a lingering sense of disquiet, unable to rationalize the depth of emotion embedded in the place. Some cried inexplicably, others found themselves haunted by the choices that Silus Harrove had almost made, choices that could have erased 12 futures in an instant. It became clear that the story was not merely historical, it was moral, ethical, and profoundly human. The land itself seemed to honor memory. Seeds sprouted beneath the oaks with an almost unnatural vigor. Animals moved through the grove cautiously, as if aware of invisible observers. Travelers who camped nearby reported vivid dreams, dreams of children running through fields, of fires that burned without consuming, of hands pressing lightly, insistently, guiding a man back to humanity. Whether hallucination or echo of history, it was consistent enough to unsettle even the most skeptical. The story of Silus Harrove and the 12 children endured in quiet ways. Families told it to their children as a lesson in empathy, morality, and courage. Historians referenced it cautiously, acknowledging its strangeness. Psychologists considered it a case of profound psychological transformation, catalyzed by trauma and guilt. But those who truly understood the tale, the descendants, the families, the local historians, knew it was more than explanation could ever capture. It was proof that even in the darkest night, human consciousness could be awakened, and even the most hardened heart could be compelled to change. Today, the Harrove land is largely unrecognizable from its former state. Residential areas, small farms, and winding roads cover what were once furrowed fields. The cemetery is maintained as a historical landmark, protected, yet still quiet and contemplative. The 12 oaks remain, their roots deep and their branches high, providing a canopy that shelters memory itself. People who visit often leave with a sense of awe, a mixture of unease and hope. They know something profound occurred here, though no one can fully explain what it was. And on quiet December nights, when the wind carries the chill of the past, some swear they feel it again. The echo of 12 children, standing in the yard, watching. They do not curse, they do not harm. They only remind those who have ears to hear that empathy is a force capable of change, that witnessing a human soul can awaken even the darkest conscience. The tale of Silus Harrove and the 12 children remains a testament, not to the power of punishment or revenge, but to the fragile, enduring power of human recognition. A story that began with terror, despair, and greed ended not with vengeance, but with transformation. And in the circle of 12 oak trees, on a quiet hill in Georgia, that story waits, silent, persistent, and impossible to forget. Decades had passed since Silus Harrove's death, but the weight of that Christmas night lingered like a ghost across the land. The 12 oak trees had grown into massive sentinels, their branches entwined overhead, creating a canopy that seemed to hum with unseen life. Locals whispered that walking among them was like stepping into a different world, where the past pressed close enough to touch, yet invisible. Generations of descendants came to honor the site. They walked slowly between the trees, sometimes speaking softly, sometimes silent. They left small offerings, flowers, trinkets, scraps of paper with names, prayers, or messages. Even those who had never met Silus knew that something had happened here, something that changed the course of lives, that had woven morality, empathy, and reckoning into the very soil. The Harrove story entered local lore, passed down in hushed tones during winter nights. Parents told it to children, not as a tale of fear, but as a lesson in seeing others, in understanding suffering. They spoke of the man who almost became a monster, and the 12 children who made him see, really see, the humanity he had tried to ignore. Each retelling shifted subtly, emphasizing different parts: the terror, the hands, the emotions, or the ultimate redemption. But the core remained: Empathy could be more powerful than any punishment, and guilt could be transformative if faced with courage. Scholars and historians visited too, drawn by the combination of documented records and impossible accounts. They pored over Silas's journals, still sealed in the archives when discovered after the plantation burned, trying to separate truth from hallucination. Some concluded that he had experienced a profound psychological break, while others believed in the possibility of something more, an inexplicable night when the innocence and courage of children confronted the darkness of an adult soul. Visitors to the oak grove today still report experiences that defy easy explanation. Some hear faint whispers or children's laughter drifting through the branches. Others feel sudden pangs of guilt, as if the land itself imposes a moral reckoning. A few claim to see shadows moving just beyond sight, silhouettes of the 12 children standing, observing, reminding anyone present that the past is never fully gone. Despite all, the story of Silus Harrove is remembered not for horror, but for transformation. The families he had enslaved, once terrified and powerless, had been allowed agency. Many left seeking freedom and opportunity, while those who remained were given tools, wages, and a chance to rebuild. The land itself was divided, 12 families receiving plots, a living memorial to the children who had forced the man to confront his conscience. And in the quiet of winter nights, when the wind whispers through the oak branches, one can almost hear the echo of that night, the fire extinguished, the darkness pressing in, the hands touching, the emotions of 12 lives overwhelming one man. A night that changed him, that shifted the moral axis of the plantation, and that left its mark across generations. The legacy of the Harrove plantation is a testament not to the cruelty that occurred there, but to the fragile power of redemption. It's a reminder that even those who have done wrong can be changed, and that empathy, once recognized, has the power to endure far beyond a single lifetime. History may forget names, dates, and details, but sometimes the weight of a single night, the courage of 12 children, and the awakening of a single man can ripple through time in ways the world can never fully explain. And so, the 12 oak trees stand, silent and eternal, guardians of a story that cannot be untold, reminding all who enter that the most haunting truths are not of ghosts or spirits, but of conscience, guilt, and the possibility of redemption. The years had softened the land, but they had not softened memory. By the turn of the century, the Harrove plantation was a quiet place, its fields slowly reclaimed by nature, its buildings long gone, leaving only the oak grove standing guard over the small hill where Silus Harrove was buried. The 12 trees, planted in his final act of humility and atonement, had grown enormous, their roots entwined like fingers holding on to the past, their branches arching high, forming a natural cathedral under which the air seemed thick with history. Local children ran through the grove, unaware of the stories carried in the wind. Farmers passed by, tipping their hats to the trees without ever knowing why, and yet something remained, something unspoken, felt rather than seen. Those who lingered often spoke of fleeting glimpses, a shadow darting behind a trunk, the faint sound of a child's laugh, a chill that passed over the skin and left the heart pounding. Visitors sometimes left with the sensation of being watched, as though unseen eyes were keeping silent vigil. Descendants of the 12 children returned occasionally, bringing flowers, photographs, and letters from relatives who had passed on stories of that miraculous night. Each visitor approached with reverence, sensing, without needing to say, that they were walking among witnesses to a truth that could not fully be explained. Some spoke in whispers to the trees, thanking them for the courage of the children, for the mercy that had been forced from a man who once could have been irredeemable. Scholars continued to debate Silus Harrove's transformation. Some insisted that the events of that Christmas night were a hallucination, a fevered psychological collapse brought on by guilt and exhaustion. Others, referencing the testimonies passed down through generations, refused to dismiss the possibility of something more, something beyond human understanding, a communion of empathy that transcended logic. They argued endlessly over journals and letters, over oral histories and oak tree rings, but none could fully reconcile the facts with reason, and perhaps that was the point. Some truths are not meant to be neatly explained. They are meant to be felt. As the 20th century progressed, the land around the Harrove plantation became farmland and residential property. Yet the 12 Oaks remained, protected as a historical landmark. At their bases, small plaques bore the names of the children who had changed a man's soul: Bess, Marcus, Lily, Samuel, Grace, Daniel, Hannah, Isaac, Abigail, Elijah, Rebecca, and Thomas. The plaques were simple, understated. They needed to be. No words could capture the enormity of what those children had done, the weight of the compassion they had forced into a heart capable of cruelty. On certain nights, when the wind moved just right, the leaves whispered in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like voices carried through time. Those who listened closely would swear they could hear faint questions echoing across generations. Do you see us? Do you remember? And in those moments, anyone who felt guilt, sorrow, or even a faint echo of past wrongdoing felt the extraordinary burden and mercy of being truly seen. Silus Harrove was long gone, but his story persisted, not as a tale of terror, not as a legend of ghosts, but as a lesson in the indelible power of conscience. He had been offered gold, power, and security, but he had refused it in favor of humanity. He had been willing to commit an unforgivable act, yet he was given a second chance, forced to witness the truth of his own soul through the courage of 12 children. And though he would die never fully absolved, he had tried to live in their memory, to honor the lives he had once thought were his to command. Visitors to the grove today sometimes leave quietly, unsettled, feeling an inexplicable mixture of grief and awe. Some carry home stories not to boast, but to pass on a warning. The most haunting night is not the one when vengeance is wrought, but when one's own conscience confronts the truth it has been hiding. And sometimes that confrontation is enough to save a soul from becoming irredeemable. The 12 oak trees stand still, eternal, guardians of a story that cannot be erased. The wind moves through their branches like whispered secrets, carrying the memory of children, the lesson of a man who almost became a monster, and the fragile, luminous possibility of redemption. And beneath the tallest of the oaks, on a small, weathered gravestone, the name Silus Harrove, 1816-1872, remains encircled by 12 living witnesses whose roots run deep into the earth, reminding all who come to see that some acts of courage, no matter how small, no matter how silent, can echo across time and change the course of history forever.